This is Terry Bible Knight, your reader. We are on Chapter 6 of C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew. This chapter is called The Beginning of Uncle Andrew's Troubles. "Let go! Let go!" screamed Polly. "I'm not touching you," said Diggory. Then their heads came out of the pool, and once more the sunny quietness of the wood between the worlds was all about them, and it seemed richer and warmer and more peaceful than ever after the staleness and ruin of the place they had just left. I think that, if they had been given the chance, they would again have forgotten who they were and where they came from, and would have lain down and enjoyed themselves, half asleep, listening to the growing of the trees. But this time, there was something that kept them as wide awake as possible, for as soon as they had got out onto the grass, they found that they were not alone. The queen, or the witch, whichever you want to call her, had come up with them, holding on fast by Polly's hair. That was why Polly had been shouting out, "Let go!" This proved, by the way, another thing about the rings which Uncle Andrew hadn't told Diggory because he didn't know it himself. In order to jump from world to world by using one of those rings, you don't need to be wearing or touching it yourself. It is enough if you are touching someone who is touching it. In that way, they work like a magnet, and everyone knows that if you pick up a pin with a magnet, any other pin which is touching the first pin will come too. Now that you saw her in the wood, Queen Jadis looked different. She was much paler than she had been, so pale that hardly any of her beauty was left, and she was stooped and seemed to be finding it hard to breathe, as if the air of that place stifled her. Neither of the children felt in the least afraid of her now. Let go of my hair," said Polly. "What do you mean by it?" "Here, let go of her hair at once," said Diggory. They both turned and struggled with her. They were stronger than she, and in a few seconds they had forced her to let go. She reeled back, panting, and there was a look of terror in her eyes. "Quick, Diggory," said Polly. "Change rings and into the home pool." "Help! Help! Mercy!" cried the witch, in a faint voice, staggering after them. "Take me with you. You cannot mean to leave me in this horrible place. It is killing me." "It's a reason of state," said Polly, spitefully, "like when you killed all those people in your own world. Do be quick, Diggory." They had put on their green rings, but Diggory said, "Oh, bother. What are we to do?" He couldn't help feeling a little sorry for the queen. "Don't be such an ass," said Polly. 10 to 1 she's only shamming. Do come on." And then both children plunged into the home pool. "It's a good thing we made that mark," thought Polly. But as they jumped, Diggory felt like a large, cold finger and thumb had caught him by the ear. And as they sank down and the confused shape of our own world began to appear, the grip of that finger and thumb grew stronger. The witch was apparently recovering her strength. Diggory struggled and kicked, but it was not of the least use. In a moment they found themselves in Uncle Andrew's study, and there was Uncle Andrew himself, staring at the wonderful creature that Diggory had brought back from beyond the world. And well he might stare. Diggory and Polly stared too. There was no doubt that the witch had got over her faintness, and now that one saw her in our own world, with ordinary things around her, she fairly took one's breath away. In Charn she had been alarming enough. In London she was terrifying. For one thing, they had not realized till now how very big she was. Hardly human was what Diggory thought when he looked at her, and he may have been right, for some say there is giantish blood in the royal family of Charn. But even her height was nothing compared with her beauty, her fierceness, and her wildness. She looked 10 times more alive than most of the people one meets in London. Uncle Andrew was bowing and rubbing his hands and looking, to tell the truth, extremely frightened. He seemed a little shrimp of a creature beside the witch. And yet, as Polly said afterwards, there was a sort of likeness between her face and his, something in the expression. It was the look that all wicked magicians have, the mark, which Jadis had said she could not find in Diggory's face. One good thing about seeing the two together was that you would never again be afraid of Uncle Andrew, any more than you'd be afraid of a worm after you met a rattlesnake, or afraid of a cow after you met a mad bull. "Phew," thought Diggory to himself. "Him a magician? Not much. Now she's the real thing." Uncle Andrew kept on rubbing his hands and bowing. He was trying to say something very polite, but his mouth had gone all dry so that he could not speak. His experiment with the rings, as he had called it, was turning out more successful than he liked. For though he had dabbled in magic for years, he'd always left all the dangers, as far as one can, to other people. Nothing at all like this had ever happened to him before. Then Jadis spoke. Not very loud, but there was something in her voice that made the whole room quiver. "Where is the magician who has called me into this world?" "Ah," Madam, gasped Uncle Andrew, I'm most honored, highly gratified, a most unexpected pleasure. If only I had the opportunity of making any preparations, Where is the magician, fool? Said Jadis. I am, madam. I hope you will excuse any liberty these naughty children may have taken. I assure you there was no intention. You? Said the queen in a still more terrible voice. Then in one stride she crossed the room, seized a great handful of Uncle Andrew's gray hair, and pulled his head back so that his face looked up into hers. Then she studied his face just as she had studied Diggory's face in the Palace of Charn. He blinked and licked his lips nervously all the time. At last she let him go, so suddenly that he reeled back against the wall. I see, she said scornfully. You are a magician, of a sort. Stand up, dog, and don't sprawl there as if you were speaking to your equals. How do you come to know magic? You are not of the royal blood, I'll swear. Well, not perhaps in the strict sense, stammered Uncle Andrew. Not exactly royal, ma'am. The Ketterleys are, however, a very old family. An old Dorsetshire family, ma'am. Peace, said the witch. I see what you are. You are a little peddling magician who works by rules and books. There's no real magic in your blood and heart. Your kind was made an end of in my world 1,000 years ago. But here I shall allow you to be my servant. I should be most happy, delighted to be of any service. A pleasure, I assure you. Peace. You talk far too much. Listen to your first task. I see we are in a large city. Procure for me at once a chariot or flying carpet or a well-trained dragon or whatever is usual for royal and noble persons in your land. Then bring me to places where I can get clothes and jewels and slaves fit for my rank. Tomorrow I will begin the conquest of the world. I'll go and order a cab at once, gasped Uncle Andrew. Stop, said the witch just as he reached the door. Do not dream of treachery. My eyes can see through walls and into the minds of men. They will be on you wherever you go. At the first sign of disobedience, I will lay such spells on you that anything you sit down on will feel like red-hot iron, and whenever you lie in a bed, there will be invisible blocks of ice at your feet. Now go. The old man went out, looking like a dog with its tail between its legs. The children were now afraid that Jadis would have something to say to them about what had happened in the wood. As it turned out, however, she never mentioned it either then or afterwards. I think, and Diggory thinks too, that her mind was of a sort which cannot remember that quiet place at all, and however often you took her there, and however long you left her there, she would still know nothing about it. Now that she was left alone with the children, she took no notice of either of them, and that was like her too. In Charn she had taken no notice of Polly, till the very end, because Diggory was the one she wanted to make use of. Now that she had Uncle Andrew, she took no notice of Diggory. I expect most witches are like that. They're not interested in things or people unless they can use them. They are terribly practical. So there was silence in the room for a minute or two, but you could tell by the way Jadis tapped her foot on the floor that she was growing impatient. Presently she said, as if to herself, "What is the old fool doing? I should have brought a ship." She stalked out of the room in pursuit of Uncle Andrew without one glance at the children. "Whew," said Polly, letting out a long breath of relief. "And now I must get home. It's frightfully late. I shall catch it." "Well, do come back as soon as you can," said Diggory. "This is simply ghastly, having her here. We must make some sort of plan." "It's up to your uncle now," said Polly. "It was he who started all this messing about with magic. All the same, you will come back, won't you? Hang it all, you can't leave me alone in a scrape like this." "I shall go home by the tunnel," said Polly, rather coldly. "That'll be the quickest way. And if you want me to come back, hadn't you better say you're sorry?" "Sorry?" exclaimed Diggory. "Well, now, if that isn't just like a girl, what have I done?" "Oh, nothing, of course," said Polly sarcastically. "Only nearly screwed my wrist off in that room with all the waxwork, like a cowardly bully. Only struck the bell with the hammer, like a silly idiot. Only turned back in the wood so she had time to catch hold of you before we jumped into our own pool. That's all." "Oh," said Diggory, very surprised. "Well, all right. I'll say I'm sorry, and I really am sorry about what happened in the waxworks room. There, I've said I'm sorry. Now do be decent and come back. I shall be in a frightful hole if you don't." "I don't see what's going to happen to you. It's Mr. Ketterley who's going to sit on red-hot chairs and have ice in his bed, isn't it?" "It isn't that sort of thing," said Diggory. "What I'm bothered about is Mother. Suppose that creature went into her room. She might frighten her to death." I see, said Polly in rather a different voice. All right, we'll call it Pax. I'll come back if I can, but I must go now. And she crawled through the little door into the tunnel, and that dark place among the rafters, which had seemed so exciting and adventurous a few hours ago, seemed quite tame and homely now. We must go back to Uncle Andrew. His poor old heart went pit-a-pat as he staggered down the attic stairs, and he kept on dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. When he reached his bedroom, which was on the floor below, he locked himself in, and at the very first thing, he groped in his wardrobe for a bottle and a wine glass, which he always kept hidden there where Aunt Letty could not find them. He poured himself out a glassful of some nasty grown-up drink and drank it all off in one gulp. Then he drew a sharp breath. Upon my word, he said to himself, I'm dreadfully shaken, most upsetting, and at my time of life. He poured out a second glass and drank it too. Then he began to change his clothes. You have never seen such clothes, but I can just remember them. He put on a very high, shiny, stiff collar of the sort that made you hold your chin up all the time. He put on a white waistcoat with a pattern on it and arranged his gold watch chain across the front. He put on his best frock coat, the one he kept for weddings and funerals. He got out his tall best hat and polished it up. There was a vase of flowers put there by Aunt Letty on his dressing table. He took one and put it in his buttonhole. He took a clean handkerchief, a lovely one, such as you couldn't buy today, out of the little left-hand drawer and put a few drops of scent on it. He took his eyeglass with a thick black ribbon and screwed it into his eye. Then he looked at himself in the mirror. Children have one kind of silliness, as you know, and grown-ups have another kind. At this moment, Uncle Andrew was beginning to be silly in a very grown-up way. Now that the witch was no longer in the same room with him, he was quickly forgetting how she had frightened him and thinking more and more of her wonderful beauty. He kept on saying to himself, "A damn fine woman, sir, a damn fine woman, a superb creature." He had also somehow managed to forget that it was the children who had got hold of this superb creature. He felt as if he himself, by his magic, had called her out of unknown worlds. "Andrew, my boy," he said to himself as he looked at the glass, "you're a devilish well-preserved fellow for your age. A distinguished-looking man, sir." You see, the foolish old man was actually beginning to imagine the witch would fall in love with him. The 2 drinks probably had something to do with it, and so had his best clothes. But he was, in any case, as vain as a peacock. That was why he had become a magician. He unlocked the door, went downstairs, sent the housemaid out to fetch a hansom — everyone had lots of servants in those days — and looked into the drawing-room. There, as he expected, he found Aunt Letty. She was busily mending a mattress. It lay on the floor near the window, and she was kneeling on it. "Ah, Letitia, my dear," said Uncle Andrew, "I have to go out. Just lend me £5 or so, there's a good girl." Girl was the way he pronounced girl. "No, Andrew dear," said Aunt Letty in her firm, quiet voice, without looking up from her work. "I've told you times without number that I will not lend you money." "Now, pray don't be tiresome, my dear girl," said Uncle Andrew. "It's most important. You will put me in a deucedly awkward position if you don't." "Andrew," said Letty, looking him straight in the face, "I wonder you are not ashamed to ask me for money." There was a long, dull story of a grown-up kind behind these words. All you need to know about it is that Uncle Andrew, what between managing dear Letty's business manners for her, and never doing any work, and ringing up large bills for brandy and cigars, which Aunt Letty had paid time and again, had made her a good deal poorer than she had been 30 years ago. "My dear girl," said Uncle Andrew, "you don't understand. I shall have some quite unexpected expenses today. I have a little entertaining to do. Come now, don't be tiresome." "And who, pray, are you going to entertain, Andrew?" asked Aunt Letty. A most distinguished visitor has just arrived." "Distinguished? Fiddlestick," said Aunt Letty. "There hasn't been a ring at the bell for the last hour." At that moment, the door was suddenly flung open. Aunt Letty looked round and saw with amazement that an enormous woman, splendidly dressed, with bare arms and flashing eyes, stood in the doorway. It was the witch. And that is the end of Chapter 6. We're on Chapter 7 of C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew. It's called What Happened at the Front Door, and I'm your reader, Terry Bibonite. "Now, slave, how long am I to wait for my chariot?" thundered the witch. Uncle Andrew cowered away from her. Now that she was really present, all the silly thoughts he had had while looking at himself in the glass were oozing out of him. But Aunt Letty at once got up from her knees and came over to the center of the room. "And who is this young person, Andrew, may I ask?" said Aunt Letty in icy tones. Distinguished foreigner, very, very important person," he stammered. "Rubbish," said Aunt Letty, and then, turning to the witch, "Get out of my house this moment, you shameless hussy, or I'll send for the police." She thought the witch must be someone out of a circus, and she did not approve of bare arms. "What woman is this?" said Jadis. "Down on your knees, minion, before I blast you." "No strong language in this house, if you please, young woman," said Aunt Letty. Instantly, as it seemed to Uncle Andrew, the queen towered up to an even greater height. Fire flashed from her eyes. She flung out her arm with the same gesture and the same horrible-sounding words that had lately turned the palace gates of Charn to dust. But nothing happened except that Aunt Letty, thinking that those horrible words were meant to be English, said, "I thought as much. The woman is drunk. Drunk! She can't even speak clearly." It must have been a terrible moment for the witch when she suddenly realized that her power of turning people into dust, which had been quite real in her own world, was not going to work in ours. But she did not lose her nerve even for a second. Without wasting a thought on her disappointment, she lunged forward, caught Aunt Letty round the neck and the knees, raised her high above her head as if she'd been no heavier than a doll, and threw her across the room. While Aunt Letty was still hurtling through the air, the housemaid, who was having a beautifully exciting morning, put her head in at the door and said, "If you please, sir, the hansom's come." "Lead on, slave," said the witch to Uncle Andrew. He began muttering something about regrettable violence, really must protest, but at a single glance from Jadis he became speechless. She drove him out of the room and out of the house, and Diggory came running down the stairs just in time to see the front door close behind them. "Jiminy," he said, "she's loose in London, and with Uncle Andrew. Wonder what on earth is going to happen now." "Oh, Master Diggory," said the housemaid, who was really having a wonderful day, "I think Miss Ketterly's hurt herself somehow." So they both rushed into the drawing room to find out what had happened. If Aunt Letty had been on bare boards or even on the carpet, I suppose all her bones would have been broken, but by great good luck she'd fallen on the mattress. Aunt Letty was a very tough old lady. Aunts often were in those days. After she had had some sal volatile and sat still for a few minutes, she said there was nothing the matter with her except a few bruises. Very soon she was taking charge of the situation. "Sarah," she said to the housemaid, who had never had such a day before, "go around to the police station at once and tell them there's a dangerous lunatic at large. I will take Mrs. Kirk's lunch up myself." Mrs. Kirk was, of course, Diggory's mother. When Mother's lunch had been seen to, Diggory and Aunt Letty had their own. After that, he did some hard thinking. The problem was how to get the witch back to her own world, or at any rate out of ours, as soon as possible. Whatever happened, she must not be allowed to go rampaging about the house. Mother must not see her. And, if possible, she must not be allowed to go rampaging about London either. Diggory had not been in the drawing room when she tried to blast Aunt Letty, but he'd seen her blast the gates at Charn, so he knew her terrible powers and did not know that she had lost any of them by coming into our world. And he knew she meant to conquer our world. At the present moment, as far as he could see, she might be blasting Buckingham Palace or the Houses of Parliament, and it was almost certain that quite a number of policemen had by now been reduced to little heaps of dust. There didn't seem to be anything he could do about that. But the rings seem to work like magnets, thought Diggory. If I can only touch her and then slip on my yellow, we shall both go into the wood between the worlds. I wonder, will she go all faint again there? Was that something the place does to her, or was it only the shock of being pulled out of her own world? I suppose I'll have to risk that. And how am I to find the beast? I don't suppose Aunt Letty would let me go out, not unless I said where I was going, and I haven't got more than 2p. I'd need any amount of money for buses and trams if I went looking all over London. Anyway, I haven't the faintest idea where to look. I wonder if Uncle Andrew is still with her. It seemed in the end that the only thing he could do was to wait and hope that Uncle Andrew and the witch would come back. If they did, he must rush out and get hold of the witch and put on his yellow ring before she had a chance to get into the house. This meant that he must watch the front door like a cat watching a mouse's hole. He dared not leave his post for a moment. So he went into the dining room and glued his face, as they say, to the window. It was a bow window from which you could see the steps up to the front door and see up and down the street so that no one could reach the front door without your knowing. I wonder what Polly's doing, thought Diggory. He wondered about this a good deal as the first slow half hour ticked on. But you need not wonder, for I'm going to tell you. She had got home late for her dinner, with her shoes and stockings very wet. And when they asked her where she'd been and what on earth she'd been doing, she said she'd been out with Diggory Kirke. Under further questioning, she said she'd got her feet in a pool of water and that the pool was in a wood. Asked where the wood was, she said she didn't know. Asked if it was in one of the parks, she said truthfully enough that she supposed it might be a sort of park. From all of this, Polly's mother got the idea that Polly had gone off without telling anyone to some part of London she didn't know, and gone into a strange park and amused herself jumping into puddles. As a result, she was told that she'd been very naughty indeed, and that she wouldn't be allowed to play with that Diggory boy any more if she was going to do things of this sort. Then she was given dinner with all the nice parts left out and sent to bed for 2 solid hours. It was a thing that happened to one quite often in those days. So while Diggory was staring out of the dining room window, Polly was lying in bed, and both were thinking how terribly slowly time could go. I think, myself, I would rather have been in Polly's position. She had only to wait for the end of her 2 hours, but every few minutes Diggory would hear a cab or a baker's van or a butcher's boy coming round the corner and think, "Here she comes," and then find it wasn't. And in between those false alarms, for what seemed hours and hours, the clock ticked on, and one big fly, high up and far out of reach, buzzed against the window. It was one of those houses that get very quiet and dull in the afternoon, and always seemed to smell of mutton. During his long watching and waiting, one small thing happened, which I shall have to mention because it comes important later on. A lady called with some grapes for Diggory's mother, and as the dining room door was open, Diggory couldn't help overhearing Aunt Letty and the lady as they talked in the hall. "What lovely grapes!" came Aunt Letty's voice. "I'm sure if anything could do her good, these would. But poor dear little Mabel, I'm afraid it would need fruit from the land of youth to help her now. Nothing in this world will do much." Then they both lowered their voices and said a lot more that he could not hear. If he had heard that bit about the land of youth a few days ago, he would have thought Aunt Letty was just talking without meaning anything in particular, the way grown-ups do, and it wouldn't have interested him. He almost thought so now. But suddenly it flashed upon his mind that he now knew, even if Aunt Letty didn't, that there really were other worlds, and that he himself had been in one of them. At that rate, there might be a real land of youth somewhere. There might be almost anything. There might be fruit in some other world that would really cure his mother. And well, you know how it feels if you begin hoping for something that you want desperately badly. You almost fight against the hope because it is too good to be true. You've been disappointed so often before. That was how Diggory felt. But it was no good trying to throttle this hope. It might, really, it just might be true. So many odd things had happened already. And he had the magic rings. There must be worlds you could get through every pool in the wood. He would hunt through them all, and then Mother would be well again. Everything would be right again. He forgot all about watching for the witch. His hand was already going into the pocket where he kept the yellow ring, when all at once he heard a sound of galloping. "Hello, what's that?" thought Diggory. "Fire engine? Wonder what house is on fire. Great Scott, it's coming here. Why, it's her." I needn't tell you who he meant by her. First came the hansom. There was no one in the driver's seat. On the roof, not sitting but standing on the roof, swaying with superb balance as it came at full speed around the corner with one wheel in the air, was Jadis, the Queen of Queens and the Terror of Charn. Her teeth were bared, her eyes shone like fire, and her long hair streamed out behind her like a comet's tail. She was flogging the horse without mercy. Its nostrils were wide and red, and its sides were spotted with foam. It galloped madly up to the front door, missing the lamp post by an inch, and then reared up on its hind legs. The hansom crashed into the lamp post and shattered into several pieces. The witch, with a magnificent jump, had sprung clear just in time and landed on the horse's back. She settled herself astride and leaned forward, whispering things in its ear. They must have been things meant not to quiet it, but to madden it. It stood on its hind legs again in a moment, and its neigh was like a scream. It was all hoofs and teeth and eyes and tossing mane. Only a splendid rider could have stayed on its back. Before Diggory had recovered his breath, a good many other things began to happen. A second hansom dashed up close behind the first. Out of it there jumped a fat man in a frock coat and a policeman. Then came a third hansom with 2 more policemen in it. After it came about 20 people, mostly errand boys, on bicycles, all ringing their bells and letting out cheers and catcalls. Last of all came a crowd of people on foot, all very hot with running, but obviously enjoying themselves. Windows shot up in all the houses of that street, and a housemaid or a butler appeared at every front door. They wanted to see the fun. Meanwhile, an old gentleman had begun to struggle shakily out of the ruins of the hansom. Several people rushed forward to help him, but as one pulled him one way and another, perhaps he would have got out quite quickly on his own. Diggory guessed that the old gentleman must be Uncle Andrew, but you couldn't see his face. His tall hat had been bashed down over it. Diggory rushed out and joined the crowd. That's the woman, cried the fat man, pointing at Jadis. Do your duty, constable. Hundreds and thousands of pounds worth she's taken out of my shop. Look at that rope of pearls round her neck. That's mine. And she's given me a black eye, too, what's more. That she has, Governor, said one to the crowd, and as lovely a black eye as I'd wish to see. Beautiful bit of work that must have been. God, she's strong, then. You ought to put a nice raw beefsteak on it, mister. That's what it wants, said a butcher's boy. Now then, said the most important of the policemen, what's all this here? I tell you, began the fat man, when someone else called out, Don't let the old cove in the cab get away. He put her up to it. The old gentleman, who was certainly Uncle Andrew, had just succeeded in standing up and was rubbing his bruises. Now then, said the policeman, turning to him, what's all this? Said Uncle Andrew's voice from inside the hat. None of that now, said the policeman sternly. You'll find this is no laughing matter. Take that hat off, see? This was more easily said than done. But after Uncle Andrew had struggled in vain with the hat for some time, 2 other policemen seized it by the brim and forced it off. Thank you, said Uncle Andrew in a faint voice. Thank you, dear me. I'm terribly shaken. If someone could give me a small glass of brandy. Now, you attend to me, if you please, said the policeman, taking out a very large notebook and a very small pencil. Are you in charge of that there young woman? Look out, called several voices, and the policeman jumped a step backwards just in time. The horse had aimed to kick at him, which probably would have killed him. Then the witch wheeled the horse around so that she faced the crowd, and its hind legs were on the forepath. She had a long, bright knife in her hand, and had been busily cutting the horse free from the wreck of the hansom. All this time, Diggory had been trying to get into a position from which he could touch the witch. This wasn't at all easy, because on the side nearest to him there were too many people, and in order to get round to the other side, he had to pass between the horse's hoofs and the railings of the area that surrounded the house, for the Ketterleys' house had a basement. If you know anything about horses, and especially if you had seen what a state that horse was in at the moment, you will realize this was a ticklish thing to do. Diggory knew lots about horses, but he set his teeth and got ready to make a dash for it as soon as he saw a favorable moment. A red-faced man in a bowler hat had now shouldered his way to the front of the crowd. Hey, policeman, he said, that's my horse what she's sitting on, same as it's my cab what she's made matchwood of. One at a time, please, one at a time, said the policeman. But there ain't no time, said the cabby. I know that horse better than you do, and it ain't an ordinary horse. His father was a officer's charger in the cavalry, he was, and if the young woman goes on exciting him, there'll be murder done. Here, let me get at him. The policeman was only too glad to have a good reason for standing further away from that horse. The cabby took a step forward, looked up at Jadis, and said in a not unkindly voice, Now, missy, let me get at his head, and just you get off. You're a lady, and you don't want all these roughs going for you, do you? You want to go home and have a nice cup of tea, and lay down quiet-like, and then you'll feel ever so much better. At the same time, he stretched out his hand toward the horse's head with the words, Steady, Strawberry, old boy, steady now. Then for the first time the witch spoke. Dog, came her clear, cold voice, ringing loud above all the other noises. Dog, unhand our royal charger. We are the Empress Jadis. And that's the end of chapter 7.